Blood sprayed from Ralph's shoulder as an alien plasma bolt seared his flesh, but he kept firing at the charging Bajorans because if his human squad failed here, the alien invasion of Cardassia Prime would consume them all. Ralph James, a 35-year-old human soldier, crouched behind a crumbling wall, his pulse rifle barking as he fired at the oncoming horde of Bajoran warriors. Sweat poured down his face inside his advanced power armor, its HUD flashing red with warnings of the suit's dwindling power reserves. Around him, the scattered remains of his once proud squad of 10 soldiers lay broken and bleeding, torn apart by the relentless onslaught of the Bajoran forces. The aliens, with their distinctive ridged noses and fanatical devotion to their strange gods, surged forward, their plasma swords and disruptor rifles cutting through the human defenses like a scythe through wheat. Ralph gritted his teeth, ignoring the searing pain in his left arm where a Bajoran blade had sliced through his armor and into his flesh. He knew that if the outpost fell, the vital communications array it housed would be lost, and with it, any hope of coordinating the human resistance across the planet. 50 Bajorans, their eyes gleaming with religious fervor and bloodlust, closed in on the outpost, their weapons raised for the final assault. Ralph's HUD showed only 3 of his squad mates still alive, their life signs weak and faltering. He cursed under his breath, realizing that they were out of options and almost out of time. Suddenly a flash of movement caught Ralph's eye. Huddled behind a shattered wall, a young Bajoran girl, no more than 16 years old, cowered in terror, her eyes wide with fear. Ralph's finger tightened on the trigger of his pulse rifle, years of training and instinct screaming at him to eliminate the threat. But something in the girl's eyes made him hesitate. She was unarmed, helpless, and clearly just as scared as he was. In that moment, Ralph made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Lowering his rifle, he lunged forward, grabbing the girl and pulling her to safety inside the outpost just as a plasma grenade detonated nearby, the explosion collapsing the entrance and trapping them inside. As the dust settled, Ralph looked down at the trembling girl in his arms, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and pain. "Pixis," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the battle raging outside. Ralph nodded, his mind racing as he assessed their situation. The outpost's communications array was damaged, and with no way to call for backup, he knew that their only chance of survival was to find a way out before the Bajorans regrouped and launched another attack. But as he looked down at Pixis, he realized that he had another mission now, one that went beyond duty or orders. He had to protect this innocent girl, no matter the cost. With a groan of pain, Ralph struggled to his feet, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. He glanced at his last surviving squadmate, a young private named Jensen, who looked back at him with a grim nod of understanding. They both knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that they had no choice but to fight, for Pixis, for humanity, and for the future of Cardassia Prime. With a groan, Ralph knelt next to Private Jack Wilson, his last surviving squadmate. Wilson's face was pale, his breaths coming in short, pained gasps as he clutched at the bloody wound in his side. Ralph pulled out the universal translator from his armor, the device's screen flickering to life as he tried to establish a connection with Pixis. "Can you understand me?" Ralph asked, his words translated into a series of guttural clicks and hisses by the device. Pixis nodded, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. I was separated from my family. The battle... It was so loud, so chaotic. I ran, ended up here." As the days passed, Ralph worked tirelessly to repair the damaged long-range communicator, his fingers deftly manipulating the delicate circuitry. Pixis watched him work, her curiosity overcoming her initial fear as she marveled at the strange technology of the humans. Ralph smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. "That's the transmit button," he explained, his words translated by the device. "When I press it, it sends a signal to my people, telling them where we are and that we need help." Pixis nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to understand. Over the next few days, Ralph taught her basic English words and phrases, the two of them bonding over their shared struggle for survival. As they talked, Ralph learned more about Pixis's life on Bajor, the hardships she'd faced as a member of the lower caste. "I was born into servitude," she explained, her eyes downcast. "My family, we were little more than slaves to the upper castes. We had no rights, no freedom." Ralph's heart broke for the young girl, the injustice of her situation all too clear. "On Earth everyone is equal," he told her, his voice filled with conviction. "No one is born into servitude. No one is treated as less than human." Pixis's eyes widened in wonder as Ralph told her stories of Earth, of the vast cities and towering skyscrapers, of the endless expanse of the human empire stretching across the stars. For a moment, the horrors of the war seemed far away, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. But as the days turned into weeks, their supplies began to dwindle, and Ralph knew that time was running out. He worked feverishly on the communicator, his fingers raw and bleeding from the constant effort. Just as he was about to give up hope, the communicator crackled to life, a faint signal pulsing through the static. Ralph's heart leaped with joy as he sent out a distress call, praying that someone, anyone, would hear it. But before he could celebrate, the outpost shook with the force of an explosion, the walls crumbling around them as the Bajorans launched another attack, this time with heavy artillery and air support. "Get down!" Ralph yelled, grabbing Pixis and Wilson and dragging them to the deepest part of the outpost. The trio huddled together as the world around them shook and crumbled, the sound of weapons fire and explosions filling the air. The Bajoran artillery fire grew heavier, slamming the outpost walls with greater frequency. Suddenly, an explosion ripped a gaping hole in the roof. Huge chunks of concrete collapsed, burying Private Wilson in the debris. Ralph gasped in shock as a heavy beam slammed onto his legs, trapping him under the rubble. He coughed up blood, struggling to stay awake from the crushing pain. Pixis screamed and ran to Ralph, pulling at the concrete slabs that pinned him. With a grunt, Ralph lifted a hand, shoving the girl away just as another deafening blast shook the room. More ceiling caved in, showering them in dust and debris, and completely burying Ralph. Pixis sobbed, clawing at the broken concrete, desperately trying to find Ralph under the pile. Without warning, a blinding white light flooded the destroyed outpost. Pixis blinked, shielding her eyes as a human dropship hovered into view, its plasma cannons still glowing from blasting a hole through the wall. Heavily armed soldiers in power armor leapt from the ship's hold, storming into the room with weapons drawn. Their leader, Sergeant Thompson, barked orders as the squad fanned out to secure the area. Two soldiers grabbed Pixis, who kicked and thrashed, yelling in Bajoran. Unable to understand her, they wrestled the girl to the ground, restraining her. Thompson surveyed the destruction, his eyes falling on a bloody hand protruding from the rubble. He quickly directed his men to start digging. After several tense minutes, they pulled Ralph's broken body from the debris. He was unconscious, his armor crushed and his legs mangled. As the medic checked Ralph's vitals, Pixis finally managed to break free. She scrambled to Ralph, tears still flowing. Ralph's eyes fluttered open. "Sarge," he croaked. "The girl, she's with me. Helped me. Don't hurt her." His eyes rolled back in his head as he passed out. Thompson nodded to his men, who released Pixis. The squad quickly loaded Ralph onto a stretcher and carried him to the waiting dropship, with Pixis close behind. The ship lifted off, racing towards the human fleet's medical frigate in orbit. On the frigate, doctors rushed Ralph into surgery as Pixis was ushered away by security personnel. For hours, she paced the waiting area, refusing to leave until she knew Ralph would be okay. Finally, a doctor emerged and informed her that Ralph was in critical condition, but stable. They had placed him in a stasis pod to heal. In the weeks that followed, Pixis remained on the frigate under the watchful eye of the human military. They soon realized her knowledge of Bajoran language and society could be invaluable to the war effort. Pixis spent hours with intelligence officers, providing insights into Bajoran tactics and culture. All the while she visited Ralph's stasis pod every day, watching as his wounds slowly healed. The more time she spent with the humans, the more she found herself drawn to their strange but fascinating culture, and to Ralph. As Ralph recovered, the two grew closer, spending long hours talking and learning about each other's worlds. Their bond was abruptly shattered when a massive explosion tore through the medical frigate. Alarms blared as fires raged across the deck. In the chaos, a Bajoran sleeper agent disguised as a human nurse grabbed Pixis, dragging her away at gunpoint. Ralph, still groggy from the stasis pod, could only watch in horror as the agent disappeared with Pixis into the smoke and flames. As the frigate's crew rushed to contain the damage and treat the wounded, Ralph struggled to his feet, his heart pounding with desperation and rage. He didn't know how, but he swore he would find Pixis and bring her back, no matter the cost. Ralph limped down the corridor of the medical frigate, his face grim with determination. The wounds from his last battle still ached, but he pushed the pain aside, focused on only one thing, saving Pixis. He barged into Captain Harris's office, slamming his fist on the desk. "So I'm going after her, sir, I have to," Ralph growled, his voice low and fierce. Captain Harris looked up, his brow furrowed. "Absolutely not. You're in no condition for a mission." "With all due respect, sir, I know Pixis better than anyone. I know how important she is to the Bajorans. We can't afford to lose her." Ralph's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with intensity. Harris studied Ralph for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, soldier. You're on the rescue team, but you follow orders, understood?" Hours later, Ralph sat in the hold of a captured Bajoran shuttle, checking his pulse rifle for the 100th time. Beside him, Sergeant Thompson and 4 other elite soldiers prepared for the infiltration. As the shuttle slipped past the compound's defenses, Ralph's heart pounded with anticipation and fear. They had to get Pixis out no matter the cost. The shuttle touched down and the team split up, Ralph and Thompson heading for the detention block. They crept through the maze-like corridors, the eerie silence broken only by the hum of their armor's power systems. Suddenly, a burst of disruptor fire erupted from ahead. Ralph dove for cover, his rifle spitting plasma bolts at the Bajoran guards. Thompson fell, a sizzling hole in his chest. Ralph cursed, dragging his friend behind a pillar. Thompson grabbed Ralph's arm, blood bubbling from his lips. "Go, get the girl," Thompson gasped, then slumped back, dead. Ralph gritted his teeth, tears stinging his eyes. He had to keep moving, for Thompson, for Pixis. He charged down the hall, rifle blazing, cutting down Bajorans left and right. At last, he reached the detention area, his armor's sensors homed in on Pixis's cell. He blasted the door open, rushing inside. Pixis looked up, her eyes wide with fear and hope. "Ralph!" she cried, leaping into his arms. A cold laugh cut through the air. Ralph spun to see a tall Bajoran woman step from the shadows, her uniform emblazoned with the insignia of a high-ranking military officer. "You're not going anywhere," she sneered. "I am Kira Nerys, and you will pay for your crimes against Bajor." Kira lunged at Ralph, a plasma blade flashing in her hand. Ralph shoved Pixis behind him, meeting Kira's attack with a ferocious counter-strike. They clashed in a whirlwind of fists and blades, Ralph's injuries screaming with every movement, but he fought on, rage and adrenaline surging through his veins. With a final brutal blow, he slammed Kira into the wall, knocking her unconscious. Ralph grabbed Pixis's hand, and they raced through the compound, alarms blaring around them. Bajoran soldiers poured into the corridors, disruptor fire filling the air. Ralph pushed Pixis ahead, shouting for her to run while he held off their pursuers. Alone, Ralph stood his ground, a one-man army against the tide of Bajoran warriors. His rifle bucked in his hands, plasma bolts ripping through armor and flesh. But still they came, an endless wave of fanatical soldiers. Just as Ralph's rifle clicked empty, a deafening roar shook the compound. The walls buckled and cracked as a massive orbital bombardment rained down from above. The human fleet had arrived, their weapons tearing the Bajoran base apart. Ralph ran, dodging falling debris and explosions, fighting his way to the extraction point. There Pixis waited, eyes filled with tears of joy, as Ralph stumbled into the shuttle. The hatch slammed shut, and the shuttle rocketed away, leaving the shattered remains of the compound behind. As they soared into space, Pixis turned to Ralph, her hand soft on his cheek. "I love you," she whispered, her lips meeting his in a fierce, passionate kiss. As the human fleet celebrated Ralph and Pixis's return, Admiral Garcia personally welcomed them aboard the flagship Indomitable. In a solemn ceremony, he pinned the Medal of Valor on Ralph's chest and granted Pixis asylum within the Empire. "Your bravery and sacrifice have turned the tide of this war," Garcia declared, shaking their hands firmly. "With your help, we will crush the Bajoran threat once and for all." In the weeks that followed, Pixis worked closely with the fleet's intelligence division, sharing her intimate knowledge of Bajoran society and military tactics. Her insights proved invaluable, allowing the humans to anticipate and counter the enemy's moves with unprecedented precision. Meanwhile, Ralph threw himself into his new role as a tactical officer, spending long hours in the Indomitable's war room, poring over star maps and battle plans. In quiet moments, he and Pixis would steal away to the observation deck, dreaming of a future together once the war was won. But their respite was short-lived. Enraged by their defeats, the Bajorans launched a devastating counterattack, their ships dropping out of warp with alarming speed and precision. At the heart of their armada loomed a monstrous dreadnought, the soul of the prophets, its hull emblazoned with sacred sigils that glowed an eerie blue. The Bajoran onslaught caught the human fleet off guard, their plasma cannons and disruptor torpedoes tearing through shields and hulls with terrifying ease. The Indomitable shuddered under the barrage, alarms blaring as crew members rushed to contain the damage. On the bridge, Ralph gripped the tactical console, his knuckles white as he watched the soul of the prophets carve a path of destruction through the human lines. "We need a plan, and fast," he growled, his eyes locked on the viewscreen. Pixis, standing beside him, suddenly stiffened, her eyes widening with realization. "The sacred chamber," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "That's the key." "The soul of the prophets," Pixis explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It houses an ancient relic, a sacred orb that the Bajorans believe grants them divine protection. If we can destroy it, their morale will crumble." Together they hurried to the Admiral's ready room, laying out their plan in urgent tones. Garcia listened intently, his expression grim. "It's a long shot," he said at last, "but it may be our only chance." Within the hour, Ralph and a hand-picked team of elite soldiers, including a newly recovered Sergeant Thompson, boarded a stealth shuttle and slipped past the Bajoran defenses. As they closed in on the soul of the prophets, Ralph felt a knot of tension in his gut. Everything hinged on this moment. Plasma fire filled the air, the stench of burnt flesh and ozone choking Ralph's lungs as he fought his way forward, his rifle bucking in his hands. Beside him, Thompson let out a battle cry, his blade flashing as he cut down the enemy with ruthless efficiency. Step by blood-soaked step, they pushed deeper into the ship, the drumbeat of war pounding in their ears. At last they reached the sacred chamber, its doors emblazoned with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Ralph pulled the charges from his pack, his heart hammering as he approached the ancient relic, but before he could plant the explosives, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, her eyes blazing with hatred. "Kira!" Ralph snarled, his hand tightening on his rifle. The Bajoran warrior smiled coldly, her plasma sword igniting with a hiss. "You didn't think I'd let you destroy our most sacred artifact, did you?" With a roar she lunged forward, her blade clashing against Ralph's in a shower of sparks. Around them the battle raged on, plasma bolts and disruptor beams crisscrossing the chamber in a deadly web. Ralph gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he parried Kira's blows, the heat of her blade searing his skin. He knew he had to end this quickly, before the Bajorans could regroup and overwhelm them. In a desperate gambit, he feinted left, then dove right, rolling under Kira's sword and coming up behind her. With a savage cry, he brought his rifle to bear, the plasma bolt catching her square in the back. Kira staggered, her eyes wide with shock and pain. But even as she fell, her hand lashed out, a hidden knife flashing towards Ralph's throat. Ralph twisted, barely avoiding Kira's plasma blade as it sizzled past his face. He stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Kira pressed her advantage, her sword a blur of crackling energy as she forced Ralph against the wall. With a savage grin, she kicked his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling to the ground. "That's over, human," Kira snarled, raising her blade for the killing blow. "Your pathetic empire ends here." Ralph's eyes widened as the sword arced down towards his throat. Suddenly, a disruptor bolt slammed into Kira's chest, hurling her across the chamber. Ralph looked up in shock to see Pixis standing in the doorway, a stolen Bajoran pistol smoking in her hand. "Pixis," Ralph gasped, struggling to his feet. "What are you doing here?" "Saving your life," Pixis replied, rushing to his side. "I couldn't let you face this alone." Together, they turned to the sacred artifact, its eerie glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Ralph pulled the charges from his pack, his hands shaking as he armed the detonators. Pixis stood guard, her pistol trained on the chamber entrance. As Ralph set the final charge, a deafening boom shook the dreadnought. He grabbed Pixis's hand, pulling her towards the exit. "We have to go now." They sprinted through the corridors, the ship shuddering and groaning around them. Bajoran soldiers lay strewn in their wake, cut down by Thompson and the rest of the infiltration team. Ralph's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the extraction point, the stealth shuttle waiting with its hatch open. Plasma bolts streaked past them as they leaped into the shuttle, Bajoran warriors pouring into the hangar bay. Thompson slammed the hatch shut, shouting for the pilot to take off. The shuttle burst from the dreadnought, engines screaming as it clawed for open space. Behind them, the soul of the prophets convulsed, explosions rippling across its hull. In a blinding flash, the dreadnought detonated, the shockwave slamming into the shuttle and sending it tumbling end over end. Ralph held Pixis close, his eyes squeezed shut as the world spun sickeningly around them. When the shuttle finally righted itself, Ralph looked out the viewport to see the Bajoran fleet in chaos. Ships burned and broke apart, their formation shattered by the loss of their flagship. The human armada, seizing the moment, surged forward, their cannons and torpedoes ripping into the disorganized Bajorans. As the shuttle docked with the Indomitable, Ralph and Pixis were greeted by a sea of cheering faces. Soldiers and crew members alike crowded around them, clapping them on the back and shouting their names. Admiral Garcia pushed through the throng, his weathered face split by a rare smile. "You did it," he said, shaking their hands firmly. "You turned the tide of this war. The Bajoran fleet is in full retreat. We've won." But even as the celebrations swept through the ship, Ralph felt a nagging sense of unease. As he and Pixis pored over the intelligence reports flooding in from the front lines, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. "Look at this," Pixis said, pointing to a series of intercepted transmissions. The Bajorans were receiving shipments of advanced weapons and technology far beyond anything we've seen from them before. Ralph frowned, his eyes scanning the data. And these encrypted communications, they're not using any Bajoran protocols. It's like they were being guided by someone else, someone pulling the strings from the shadows. As the evidence mounted, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Bajorans had not been acting alone. A mysterious alien race, known only as the Shadows, had been manipulating the conflict from behind the scenes, supplying the Bajorans with the means to wage war against the humans. Ralph and Pixis, their ranks elevated to captain and commander, in recognition of their vital role in the war, found themselves at the forefront of a new battle. Tasked with leading a special task force to uncover the Shadows' true motives, they delved into a web of conspiracy and deceit that threatened to unravel everything they had fought for. Piece by piece, they uncovered a chilling reality. The Shadows had infiltrated both the human and Bajoran governments, manipulating events to drive the two species towards mutual destruction. The war, it seemed, had been merely a smokescreen for a far more sinister agenda. As Ralph and Pixis raced to expose the Shadow conspiracy, They knew that time was running out. The shadows were moving towards their endgame, a cataclysmic event that would annihilate both humans and Bajorans alike. With the fate of two civilizations hanging in the balance, Ralph and Pixis gathered their team of elite soldiers and spies, determined to stop the shadows at any cost. In the heart of enemy territory, they launched a desperate mission to infiltrate the Shadow's central command, a massive, labyrinthine structure hidden deep within an uncharted nebula. As they fought their way through armies of shadow drones and mind-controlled thralls, Ralph and Pixis pushed ever closer to the truth, to the dark heart of the conspiracy that had brought their worlds to the brink of destruction. In the final climactic battle, Ralph and his team confronted the Shadow leadership, a cabal of ancient, malevolent beings who had orchestrated the conflict for their own twisted ends. In a desperate struggle, Ralph and Pixis fought side by side, their weapons blazing and their hearts pounding as they battled to save everything they held dear. As the Shadow Command Center crumbled around them, Ralph and Pixis made a final daring escape, their ship blasting free of the collapsing structure just as it exploded in a blinding flash of light. Battered and bloodied but unbroken, they turned their faces towards home, towards a future free from the Shadow's malign influence. But even as they celebrated their hard-won victory, Ralph knew that the fight was far from over. The Shadows had been defeated, but their legacy lived on, in the scars left on the human and Bajoran psyches, in the shattered trust between their peoples. Rebuilding would be a long and difficult road, one that would test the strength and resolve of both civilizations. As Ralph looked out at the stars, Pixis by his side, he knew that they would face the challenges ahead together, united by the bond they had forged in the crucible of war. They had fought for peace, for the chance to build a better future. And now, with the shadow of war finally lifted, that future stretched out before them, full of promise and hope. And as their ship sailed onwards through the endless expanse of space, Ralph knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them head-on, side by side, ready to fight for the future they had won. The war may have ended, but their story was just beginning. A story of love and loss, of sacrifice and triumph, of two hearts beating as one against the darkness of the universe. As Ralph and Pixis pored over the data they'd seized from the Shadow outposts, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Shadows weren't a single race, but a fanatical coalition of species, all united in their twisted belief that peace was a lie. Only through endless conflict could the galaxy truly evolve and progress. "They're insane," Pixis whispered, her eyes wide with horror as she read the Shadow manifestos. "They want to tear down everything we've built, plunge the galaxy into eternal war." Ralph nodded grimly, his jaw clenched. "And they've been manipulating us all along. The Bajoran-human war, the weapons shipments, the soul of the Prophet's attack. It was all part of their plan." Determined to stop the Shadows, Ralph and Pixis launched a series of lightning raids on Shadow supply lines and command centers. They struck hard and fast, seizing crucial intel and dealing crippling blows to the Shadow war machine. But their victories came at a cost. The Shadow leadership, enraged by the task force's success, unleashed their deadliest weapon, Nemesis, a genetically engineered super soldier trained in alien martial arts and equipped with advanced stealth tech. Nemesis struck without warning, materializing out of thin air in the heart of the task force's base. In a blur of motion, he cut down a dozen soldiers, their blood splattering the walls as they fell. Ralph charged forward, his plasma saber igniting with a hiss, but Nemesis was already gone, vanishing into the shadows. Over the next weeks, Nemesis waged a campaign of terror, ambushing task force members on missions, infiltrating their safe houses, and slaughtering them in their sleep. The task force's numbers dwindled, each death a blow to Ralph and Pixis's resolve. Ralph stood in the center of the abandoned warehouse, his saber gripped tight. Pixis crouched in the shadows, her fingers flying over her hacking rig. The air shimmered, and Nemesis appeared, his eyes glowing red, his blades humming with energy. The two warriors clashed in a storm of sparks, their blades moving faster than the eye could follow. Ralph parried and spun, his saber a whirling wall of plasma. But Nemesis was relentless. his strikes precise and brutal. A cut slipped through Ralph's defenses, searing across his ribs. Another slashed his thigh. Ralph stumbled, his blood dripping to the floor. Nemesis raised his blade for the killing blow. Suddenly he stiffened, his body convulsing as arcs of electricity crackled over his skin. Pixis, her face tight with concentration, had hacked his cybernetic implants, overloading his systems. Nemesis collapsed, smoke rising from his twitching form. Ralph staggered over to the fallen assassin, ripping a neural jack from his pocket. He jammed it into Nemesis's skull port, downloading the location of the shadow leadership. Ralph and Pixis shared a look of grim determination, their eyes hard with the knowledge of what must be done. The final battle was coming, and the fate of the galaxy would hang in the balance. Ralph felt the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders as he stood at the door of the dropship, the smell of oil and scorched metal thick in his nostrils. Around him, his team checked weapons and cinched armor straps, their expressions carved from stone. They all knew this was the end game. Succeed here and the shadows would fall. Fail, and darkness would consume everything. The dropship shuddered as it tore through the upper atmosphere of the shadow homeworld, anti-aircraft fire streaking past the viewports. Ralph gripped the overhead strap as the ship banked hard, the pilot taking evasive maneuvers. 30 seconds, the pilot yelled over the comm, his voice taut with adrenaline. Ralph turned to his team, his gaze sweeping over Pixis, Sergeant Thompson, and the other hardened veterans who had been through hell with him. This is it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Everything we've fought for, everyone we've lost. It all comes down to this. The shadows think they can break us, but they're wrong. We're human. We're Bajoran. We don't break. We fight. A chorus of cheers and battle cries filled the dropship as it swooped low over the shadow citadel, a towering spire of black metal and pulsing energy. The hatch blew open, and Ralph leapt out, his plasma saber blazing to life as he hit the ground. Pixis and the others followed, fanning out in a practiced formation as shadow warriors poured from the citadel gates. Plasma bolts and disruptor beams crisscrossed the battlefield as the two forces clashed. Ralph charged into the fray, his saber a blur of light as he cut down shadow after shadow. Beside him, Pixis fought with fluid grace, her hacking rig sparking as she overloaded shadow weapons and armor. But for every shadow that fell, another seemed to take its place. Ralph gritted his teeth as a plasma bolt seared his shoulder, the smell of burnt flesh filling his nostrils. He could feel his team tiring, their movements slowing, their fire less accurate. They needed a miracle. Suddenly, the sky above the citadel shimmered and warped. A massive human Bajoran fleet dropped out of hyperspace, their ships gleaming in the sunlight. "Ground team, this is Admiral Garcia," a voice crackled over Ralph's comm. "Heard you could use some backup. Danger close, danger close." Ralph's heart surged with hope as the fleet opened fire, their orbital bombardment tearing through the shadow defenses like tissue paper. The citadel shook and crumbled, huge chunks of debris raining down on the battlefield. Ralph pressed forward, his team close behind, fighting their way into the heart of the shadow stronghold. In the central chamber, they found the shadow leadership, a cadre of withered aliens in flowing robes. Ralph leveled his saber at the leader, a tall figure with eyes like pits of darkness. "It's over," Ralph snarled. "Your fleets are in ruins, your strongholds captured. Surrender and you may yet live." The shadow leader laughed, a sound like the cracking of ice. "You understand nothing, human," it hissed. "We are not the beginning, nor are we the end. We are but instruments of the true power that shapes the cosmos. You have won a battle, but the war is eternal." With a final defiant screech, the shadow leader pressed a button on its throne. A blinding flash consumed the chamber, a wave of searing heat and blinding light that Ralph barely managed to throw up a plasma shield against. When the glare faded, the shadow leadership was gone, consumed by their own self-destruct. Ralph sagged against the throne, exhaustion and the aftershocks of adrenaline making his limbs tremble. Pixis rushed to his side, her hands gentle as she checked his wounds. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice raw with hope and fear. Ralph looked around at the shattered chamber, at the bodies of shadow warriors strewn across the floor. "For now," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the future. But the shadow leader was right about one thing. The war is eternal. As long as there are those who believe that conflict is the only way forward, there will always be another battle to fight. He straightened, his hand finding Pixis's and holding tight. "But we'll be there to meet it together. For the lost, and for those yet to come. We'll stand against the darkness, and we'll never stop fighting for the light." With a final squeeze of Pixis's hand, Ralph turned and strode from the chamber, his team falling in behind him. The Shadow War was over, but the struggle for peace, for a galaxy where humans and Bajorans and all the myriad races of the cosmos could live in harmony, that struggle had only just begun. Ralph's knuckles tightened on the throttle of his starfighter as the shadow base grew larger in his view screen. The sleek ship shuddered as another plasma blast impacted its shields, alarms blaring in the cockpit. Ralph gritted his teeth, juking and weaving through the swarm of enemy fighters. "All wings form up on me," he barked into the comm. "We punch a hole through their defenses, no matter the cost." A chorus of affirmatives crackled over the channel as Ralph's squadron formed a tight wedge behind him. Ahead, the shadow warships loomed like ancient sea beasts, their hulls bristling with cannon turrets. Lances of searing light erupted from their prows, scything through the human Bajoran fleet. Ralph watched a friendly frigate take a direct hit, its hull splitting open like a cracked egg. Bodies and debris spilled into the void. Ralph's jaw clenched as he wrenched his fighter into a sharp dive, plasma cannons spitting fire. A shadow fighter exploded under his onslaught, then another. Ralph rolled and looped, his ship dancing through the chaos of the battle. His wingmates followed suit, their weapons raking the enemy ships. On the planet below, Pixis crouched behind a shattered boulder, her infiltration team huddled around her. The towering black spire of the shadow base loomed ahead, its obsidian surface pulsing with malevolent energy. "The shield generator is 2 clicks north," Pixis whispered, consulting her holomap. "We take it out or the fleet gets slaughtered." Her team nodded grimly, checking their weapons. They were the best of the best, handpicked by Pixis for their skill and courage, but even they balked at the odds they faced. Pixis raised a fist, then gestured forward. The team moved out, darting from cover to cover as they approached the base. Shadow warriors patrolled the perimeter, their black armor melding with the darkness. "We hit them fast and hard," she said. "No mercy, no survivors." As one, the team burst from cover, weapons blazing. The shadows reacted instantly, their own rifles spitting plasma. But Pixis's team was faster. They cut down the guards in a hail of fire, then charged the generator. Pixis sprinted to the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. With a final keystroke, the generator whined and died, its energy dissipating. Above, the base's shields flickered and vanished. "The path is clear," Pixis shouted into her comm. "All ground forces, advance." Like a tidal wave of steel, the human Bajoran army surged forward, tanks and artillery roaring across the blasted landscape. At their head rode Sergeant Thompson, his power armor glinting in the dim light. The shadow base's defenses opened fire, plasma bolts and missiles streaking towards the advancing army. Explosions ripped through the human Bajoran lines, vaporizing soldiers and vehicles in sprays of molten metal. But the army pressed on, their weapons hammering the base's walls. Slowly, inexorably, they battered their way inside, engaging the shadow defenders in brutal close-quarters combat. In the skies above, Ralph and his squadron dueled with the shadow fighters, their ships weaving intricate patterns of death. Ralph gritted his teeth as a plasma bolt seared his wing, alarms screaming in his cockpit. He glanced at his sensor display, his eyes widening. A massive shadow dreadnought was rising from the far side of the planet, its hull dwarfing the other ships. Its weapons were powering up, preparing to unleash a devastating barrage on the human Bajoran fleet. Ralph keyed his comm. "All ships, concentrate fire on that dreadnought," he yelled. "We have to take it down now." As one, The fleet turned its guns on the dreadnought, missiles and plasma bolts hammering its shields. But the behemoth shrugged off the attack, its own weapons glowing with deadly power. Suddenly, a series of massive explosions ripped through the base below, the ground heaving and buckling. The dreadnought lurched, its shields flickering. "The overlords!" Pixis's voice crackled over the comm. "We've got them cornered in the command center. They're trying to scuttle the base and take us all with them." Ralph's heart raced as he saw his chance. Yanking his fighter into a steep dive, he accelerated towards the dreadnought, his weapons primed. Behind him, his squadron followed, their ships screaming through the void. The dreadnought loomed before them, its hull filling their view screens. Ralph gritted his teeth, his finger tightening on the trigger. This was it, the moment of truth. Inside the base, Pixis and her team burst into the command center, their weapons leveled at the overlords. The hooded figures stood around a massive holographic display, their hands raised in supplication. Then, from the back of the group, Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, his helmet retracting to reveal his grizzled face. "The enemy of my enemy," he growled, "is my friend." Pixis whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Are you insane?" she shouted. "They started this war. They're responsible for millions of deaths." Thompson shook his head. "And how many more will die if these devourers arrive?" he asked. "We need the Shadow's knowledge, their technology. We can't face this threat alone." He took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. He knew what he had to do. A violent tremor rocked the base, the reinforced walls quaking under the sudden assault. Klaxons blared, red warning lights flashing in the dimly lit command center. Ralph gripped the edge of the holographic table, his eyes widening in disbelief as the Overlord's words sank in. The Devourers, the ancient threat they had spoken of, were here. The main view screen flared to life, revealing a sight that chilled Ralph to his core. A colossal ship, its hull a twisted mass of organic and metallic components, loomed in the planet's atmosphere. Tendrils of pulsating flesh extended from the monstrosity, writhing and coiling as they reached towards the surface. "By the gods," Pixis breathed, her face pale with horror. "What is that thing?" "The Devourers," the lead overlord rasped, his voice thick with dread. "A hive mind of assimilated species, bent on consuming all in their path. We must act now, or all will be lost." Chaos erupted as the Shadows and the human Bajoran forces scrambled to defend the base. Ralph turned to Pixis, his expression grim. "Get to the superweapon," he ordered. "I'll buy you as much time as I can." Pixis nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Be careful, Ralph. Come back to me." Ralph pulled her into a fierce embrace, their lips meeting in a desperate kiss. Then he turned and sprinted for the hangar bay, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, the battle raged, the air thick with plasma fire and the screams of the dying. Ralph leapt into his fighter, the engines roaring to life as he rocketed into the sky. The Devourer ship loomed before him, a nightmarish vision of twisted flesh and metal. Tentacles lashed out at Ralph's fighter, seeking to ensnare him. He jinked and wove, his plasma cannons spitting fire as he dodged the grasping appendages. The hull of the Devourer ship shuddered under his assault, ichor spewing from ruptured flesh. But the monstrous vessel seemed to shrug off the damage, its tendrils regenerating even as Ralph blasted them apart. He gritted his teeth, desperation clawing at his heart. He had to find a weakness, some way to bring this abomination down. Then he saw it, a pulsing mass at the heart of the ship, glowing with an eerie, sickly light, the reactor core. Ralph gunned his engines, weaving through a maelstrom of tentacles and energy beams as he raced towards his target. The Devourer ship seemed to sense his intent, its tendrils redoubling their efforts to swat him from the sky. Ralph's fighter shuddered as a glancing blow ripped through his shields, alarms screaming in the cockpit. But he pushed on, his eyes narrowed in concentration. With a final desperate burst of speed, he lined up his shot and fired, a lance of pure plasma energy spearing into the heart of the reactor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a blinding explosion erupted from the Devourer ship, a shockwave of energy slamming into Ralph's fighter and sending him tumbling through the air. He fought with the controls, struggling to right his craft as the monstrous vessel shuddered and convulsed, its hull rupturing in a cascade of secondary explosions. With a final agonized roar, the Devourer ship listed to the side, its tendrils flailing uselessly as it plummeted towards the ground. Ralph watched in awe as the monstrosity crashed into the surface, a plume of dust and debris rising from the impact site. But there was no time to celebrate. On the ground, hordes of Devourer creatures poured from the wreckage of the ship, their misshapen bodies lurching towards the shadow base with single-minded purpose. Ralph landed his fighter, leaping from the cockpit and racing towards the command center. He found Pixis and the overlords huddled around the ancient superweapon, its surface thrumming with barely contained power. "The device is almost charged," Pixis reported, her face streaked with sweat and grime. "But the Devourers are breaking through our defenses. We need more time." Together they raced outside to join the fray, the air shimmering with the heat of plasma fire. The Devourer creatures were everywhere, their twisted forms lunging at the defenders with terrifying speed and strength. Ralph lost himself in the rhythm of battle, his rifle bucking in his hands as he cut down the monstrosities one by one. Beside him, Pixis fought with the grace of a dancer, her energy blades flashing as she spun and wove through the horde. But for every creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. Ralph's muscles burned with fatigue, his armor dented and scorched from the relentless assault. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the din of battle. Ralph turned to see a massive Devourer beast charging towards the command center, its maw gaping wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. The overlords moved to intercept, their energy blasts slamming into the creature's armored hide. But the beast shrugged off the attack, its lumbering strides carrying it closer and closer to the superweapon. Ralph's heart leapt into his throat. If the creature reached the device before it could fire, all would be lost. He raised his rifle to fire, but his weapon clicked empty, its power cell drained. In that moment, one of the overlords stepped forward, his eyes blazing with resolve. He charged towards the beast, his staff crackling with arcane energy. The overlord leapt at the creature, his staff plunging into its gaping maw. The beast convulsed, its body spasming as the energy from the staff coursed through its twisted flesh. With a final agonized roar, the creature toppled to the ground, its massive form crushing the overlord beneath it. But his sacrifice had bought them the time they needed. A blinding pulse of energy erupted from the superweapon, washing over the battlefield in a wave of searing light. Ralph felt the energy pass through him, a tingling sensation that set his teeth on edge. The Devourer creatures howled in agony, their bodies convulsing as the pulse severed their connection to the hive mind. They stumbled and fell, their limbs twitching spasmodically as they collapsed to the ground. Across the battlefield, the Shadow and human Bajoran forces rallied, their weapons tearing into the disoriented creatures with renewed fury. The tide of battle had turned, the Devourers now easy prey for the vengeful defenders. Ralph turned to Pixis, a weary smile tugging at his lips. They had done it. Against all odds, they had defeated the Devourers and saved the galaxy from annihilation. But even as they celebrated their victory, Ralph knew that the true battle was just beginning. The revelation of the Devourers had shaken the very foundations of their understanding, and the alliance between the humans, Bajorans, and Shadows was a fragile one at best. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome and sacrifices to be made. But with Pixis by his side and the dream of a united galaxy to guide them, Ralph knew that they would face whatever the future held with courage and determination. They had fought for peace, and now it was within their grasp. All they had to do was reach out and take it, one step at a time. Ralph stood amidst the smouldering wreckage of the shadow base, his armor dented and scorched, his face streaked with soot and blood. Around him, the survivors of the battle tended to their wounded and honored their fallen comrades. Sergeant Thompson lay among the dead, his lifeless eyes staring up at the alien sky. Ralph knelt beside his friend, closing his eyes with a trembling hand. Pixis limped to Ralph's side, her own armor battered and torn. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch a silent comfort in the midst of the carnage. Together, they gazed out at the battlefield, the gravity of their victory slowly sinking in. Ralph nodded, his jaw tight. For now, but they'll be back. And next time, they'll be even stronger. A sudden commotion drew their attention. A group of soldiers, their faces grim, approached with a portable comm unit. "Captain Commander," one of them said, saluting. "We've just received a distress call from the Prometheus colony. They're under attack by Devourer forces." Ralph and Pixis exchanged a look, their weariness momentarily forgotten. The Prometheus colony, a remote human settlement on the edge of known space, had been out of contact for months. Most assumed them lost, destroyed by the shadows, or worse. But if there were survivors— "How many?" Ralph asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Unknown, sir, but the message said they were holding out in the central compound, surrounded on all sides." Pixis turned to Ralph, her eyes fierce with determination. "We have to help them." Ralph nodded, his resolve hardening. "Agreed, but we can't take the fleet. They're needed here to secure the planet and tend to the wounded." "Then we go alone," Pixis said, her voice brooking no argument. "You and me, a small strike team. We can move faster, avoid detection." Ralph hesitated, the thought of splitting up from Pixis now after all they'd been through, sending a spike of fear through his heart. But he knew she was right. The colonists needed them, and they were the only ones who could reach them in time. "All right," he said at last, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll take a stealth ship, a squad of our best fighters. We leave in an hour." As the soldiers hurried off to make preparations, Ralph turned to Pixis, pulling her close. He kissed her fiercely, pouring all his love and fear and desperate hope into the embrace. Pixis clung to him, her own emotions raw and powerful. "And I love you," Pixis replied, her voice thick with tears, "forever and always." Hand in hand they turned towards the waiting stealth ship, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the dangers ahead. But they were together, bound by a love that had survived war and chaos and the very fabric of the universe itself. And together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, no matter the cost. The ship's engines roared to life, the sleek craft lifting off from the planet's surface and angling towards the stars. In the cockpit, Ralph and Pixis sat side by side, their eyes locked on the swirling vortex of hyperspace as the ship accelerated to light speed. The battle was over. The war was won. But for Ralph and Pixis, the fight was just beginning. A new adventure awaited them, a new chance to make a difference in a galaxy torn apart by conflict and strife. And they would face it as they always had. Together, united by a bond that could never be broken. The ship vanished into the depths of space, a gleaming speck swallowed by the infinite void. And on the planet below, the survivors of the battle looked up at the stars, their hearts filled with hope and dread for the future that lay ahead. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.